Deep in the Pacific conflict, Japanese sailors traded quiet rumors about an American cruiser. When she lit up the dark waters of Guadalcanal, her cannons fired so rapidly they sounded like heavy machine guns tearing through fabric. They were right to fear her. The USS Helena had already survived an attack that was supposed to leave her at the bottom of a harbor, returning to the open ocean with a specific mechanical vengeance. Her story actually starts years earlier, during the depths of the Great Depression. As the United States Navy moved to modernize its aging fleet, engineers drew up plans for the St. Louis-class light cruisers. The design philosophy was simple: pack in 15 main guns and give the ship the speed to survive delivering that ordnance. By December 1936, the workers at the Brooklyn Navy Yard were laying down the keel for hull number 50. Between the massive cranes and the New York skyline, thousands of riveters and welders were shaping 600 feet of steel into a weapon of survival. This industrial push delivered a cruiser optimized for high-volume fire. It was a specific mechanical advantage that would soon be tested against the surface combatants of the Japanese Navy in the narrow slots of the Solomon Islands. In the water, Helena cut a long, sleek profile. She stretched 608 feet from stem to stern, with a narrow beam of just 61 feet, allowing her to slice cleanly through the waves. Her primary threat lay in her main battery, 15 6-inch guns arranged in 5 triple turrets. In optimal conditions, her gun crews could cycle rounds fast enough to hurl 150 shells per minute at an enemy target. It was a volume of fire that would eventually earn her the title of the machine gun cruiser. For closer threats, her secondary battery featured 8 5-inch dual-purpose guns. These were highly versatile, built to swat enemy aircraft from the sky or punish any destroyers that got too close. Below deck, 4 Parsons turbines generated a staggering 100,000 horsepower. That propulsion pushed her to a top speed of 32.5 knots, and with a range of 10,000 nautical miles, she had the endurance to hunt anywhere on the map. But specs on a blueprint don't fight battles. Operating a machine of this scale required a precise synchronization of human effort. It took 868 officers and men working in tandem to bring her to life. The thickest armor and fastest turbines mean little on their own. It was this specific crew that would eventually take all that steel and gunpowder and earn the ship her reputation in combat. Helena was christened in the late summer of 1938 and officially commissioned for peacetime service in September 1939. Early on, her deployments felt more like a travelogue than preparation for conflict. That illusion broke during a voyage south to Uruguay. Sitting in the waters of Montevideo Harbor was the wreckage of the German pocket battleship Graf Spee, recently scuttled after taking heavy fire. For the young American sailors lining Helena's rails, staring at thousands of tons of twisted, ruined metal was a sobering experience. They were looking directly at the lethal reality of modern naval gunnery. The sight stripped away the optimism of their peacetime tour. It provided a stark preview of the violence that was rapidly engulfing the rest of the world and the specific type of fight they were about to enter. By September 1940, the Navy transferred Helena to the Pacific Fleet. She spent the next year in Hawaiian waters, running through repetitions of gunnery drills, damage control exercises, and fleet maneuvers. As tensions in the Pacific tightened in late 1941, she was ordered to the Mare Island Navy Yard. There, crews upgraded her defenses, welding brand-new 1-punch anti-aircraft batteries to her decks. These weren't standard maintenance checks. The military was handing their ship the bare-knuckle tools she would need for an imminent brawl. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Helena was moored in Pearl Harbor at berth 1010. She wasn't actually supposed to be there. The massive battleship Pennsylvania usually occupied that spot, but she had been moved to a dry dock for repairs. Helena simply took the open pier. Just before 8 a.m., 9 Japanese Kate torpedo bombers descended through the early morning haze. The pilots were specifically looking for the Pennsylvania. Through the fog, Helena's profile looked close enough to a battleship to seal her fate. Believing they had a battleship in their sights, the lead pilot released a Type 91 torpedo into the harbor. A routine scheduling change at the dock, combined with morning weather conditions, had turned a light cruiser into a primary target for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The weapon cut through the placid water at 40 knots. It passed beneath the mine layer moored alongside and slammed into Helena at frame 75, detonating just below her armor belt. The blast tore a massive hole into her engineering spaces. In a fraction of a second, engine room number 1 and boiler room number 2 were obliterated, and seawater poured into the ship. But the crew reacted instantly. Within 120 seconds of the explosion, they had the forward diesel generators roaring online, forcing electricity back to the gun mounts. As the second wave of Japanese bombers wheeled overhead, Helena's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. Her gunners fought back through the blinding smoke, absorbing the shockwaves of 4 separate bombs that narrowly missed her decks. She survived because her crew executed their damage control protocols under fire, refusing to abandon their stations, even as the harbor burned around them. The survival came at a steep cost. 40 of her men were killed in the strike, and over 100 more were wounded. Down in the wardroom, medical teams performed triage on the injured, while the gunners stayed locked on their targets topside. Looking out across the harbor, they could see the remains of battleships that hadn't been so lucky. When the Japanese pilots returned to their carriers, they filed their action reports. They claimed they had sent the ship at berth 1010 to the bottom. The reports of her sinking were premature. By failing to finish the job, the Japanese left behind a crew that had already proven they could return fire in under 2 minutes, a precursor to the relentless performance that would soon define her return to the Pacific. In the immediate aftermath of December 7, 1941, the American Pacific Fleet was crippled. Battleships sat resting in the mud of Pearl Harbor, and the surviving ships faced an Imperial Japanese Navy that held absolute dominance in nighttime engagements. The light cruiser USS Helena survived the initial strike, but she resembled a patient in intensive care. Torpedo damage left ocean water sloshing through her wounded hull. Emergency pumps ran around the clock just to keep her from sinking to the harbor floor. 2 days later, she limped into dry dock number 2. Navy yard workers immediately swarmed her sides, cutting, shaping, and welding raw steel plates directly over her open wounds. It was triage, a temporary patch designed only to keep the ocean out. In January 1942, Helena began a perilous journey toward a proper shipyard at Mare Island, California. Massive Pacific swells pressed relentlessly against her patched hull, searching for a weakness. Below decks, her crew stood vigilant at their damage control stations, ready to shore up any sudden breaches. She arrived battered, but entirely intact. The temporary welds had held, delivering a massive warship ready for a complete overhaul. The Imperial Navy believed their strike had permanently neutralized the American threat. Instead, Helena's escape across the Pacific ensured the United States preserved a hull that would be rebuilt with the specific goal of hunting Japanese ships in the dark. At the Mare Island shipyard, the Navy applied the bitter, brutal lessons they had learned at Pearl Harbor to completely rebuild the surviving fleet. Helena's physical structure was gutted. Her heavy, restrictive conning tower was completely removed and replaced with an open bridge to maximize a commander's visibility during night engagements. Her antiquated 1.1-inch guns were stripped away and replaced by 4 quadruple 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft mounts. This visualization demonstrates the cruiser's new SG surface search radar. By emitting silent waves, the technology pinged enemy vessels miles away through pitch darkness. Helena could now fight blind, seeing the Japanese fleet while remaining completely invisible. Under Captain Robert English, the crew weaponized this new technology with fanatical training. Gunnery and damage control teams drilled endlessly until their physical responses became automatic muscle memory. The motivation in the mess halls was clear: revenge. By July 1942, she passed beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, heading west. Deep inside the hull, mechanics coaxed every possible revolution from her turbines to maximize speed. When Helena returned to the Pacific, she was a highly lethal instrument optimized for the darkest nights of naval combat. By late 1942, the Pacific theater centered entirely on the Solomon Islands. Guadalcanal had become a grueling green hell, with American and Japanese forces wading through the coastal waters to bleed for every single inch of jungle. This map highlights the slot, a narrow channel where Japanese ships ran high-speed night missions to resupply garrisons. To cut off this line, Admiral Scott positioned Task Force 64 off Cape Esperance to spring a trap. But Scott made a critical tactical error. He chose the heavy cruiser USS San Francisco as his flagship. Because the San Francisco lacked the advanced SG radar, the admiral commanding the ambush was essentially operating blind. On October 11th, Admiral Aritomo Goto sailed a force of Japanese heavy cruisers and destroyers straight toward the American lines. At 23:25, in total pitch blackness, Helena's radar operator saw a phosphorescent blip appear on his scope. He detected the enemy formation at 27,700 yards. Long before a single lookout could spot a silhouette, Helena had found her targets. The United States Navy had finally secured the element of surprise in the enemy's own domain. This diagram illustrates a devastating naval geometry known as crossing the T. Operating without radar, Admiral Scott accidentally ordered a column turn that placed his force directly across the path of the Japanese fleet, pointing American broadsides at approaching enemy bows. On Helena's bridge, Captain Gilbert Hoover watched his radar screen in agonizing tension. The Japanese fleet closed to 5,000 yards, practically point-blank range for heavy naval guns, but Admiral Scott still hadn't given the order to fire. At 23:46, Scott sent an ambiguous "Roger" to a query. Hoover took it as permission to engage, and the main turrets instantly erupted. The first salvo caught the Japanese flagship Aoba completely unprepared. 6-inch shells hammered her bridge, killing Admiral Goto instantly. He died never even realizing it was the Americans who were attacking him. Helena's loaders worked with terrifying synchronized perfection. She achieved rates of fire so intense that sustained muzzle flashes lit up the night, earning her a permanent nickname, the Machine Gun Cruiser. Aboard the Japanese vessels, there was absolute chaos. They were sailing blind into a wall of deadly mechanical precision directed entirely by American radar. Trying to shield the flagship, the heavy cruiser Furutaka steered directly into the American crossfire. Helena's shells found her torpedo tubes, causing Japan's most feared weapon, the long lance torpedo, to explode directly on their own deck. The ship burned fiercely before sinking beneath the black water. The entire engagement lasted just 14 minutes. In that tiny window, Helena fired over 1,400 rounds. By the time the guns fell silent, her barrels were glowing cherry red in the dark. When dawn broke over Cape Esperance, the surface of the water was covered in vast oil slicks and floating debris, the only remaining markers of the Japanese warships. Helena's crew stood exhausted, completely drained by the adrenaline of the ambush. They had finally secured the victory they had relentlessly drilled for since the morning of Pearl Harbor. The victory at Cape Esperance shifted the balance in the Solomons. Helena had proven the technological tide was turning, and the United States was ready to challenge the enemy's dominance of night combat. By November 1942, the Solomon Islands were a miserable, disease-ridden environment. Months of bombardment had reduced the jungle into a cratered wasteland. Men stationed in these waters lived under the constant threat of submarines and sudden night attacks. The crew of the cruiser USS Helena developed the 1,000-yard stare common to Guadalcanal veterans. Sailors physically aged beyond their years by sheer exhaustion and relentless vigilance. Yet, in the middle of this grinding routine, a surreal culture flourished aboard the ship. Between actions, the ship's brass band, known as Helena's Hottentots, gathered on deck, playing swing music that carried across the water to the fleet. Meals usually consisted of Spam and powdered eggs, making the ship's ice cream maker the most valuable machine in the South Pacific. Whenever it was working, sailors would eagerly trade almost any possession they had for a single Dixie cup of vanilla. Captain Hoover understood his men. He ran them through rigorous drills to ensure they survived combat, but he allowed these small, bizarre comforts to keep them mentally intact while living in a meat grinder. That mental endurance was about to be tested. A massive Japanese reinforcement convoy was sailing down the corridor known as the Slot. Their primary objective was to unleash a heavy bombardment force and obliterate the critical American airstrip, Henderson Field. Standing between the Japanese guns and the airstrip was an American task force, newly commanded by Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan. Lacking night combat experience, Callahan made a fatal error, organizing his fleet to lead from the cruiser San Francisco, not the Helena. The San Francisco lacked sensory equipment. While the fleet sailed blind into pitch-black waters, Helena's new SG radar could see for miles. Deep inside the ship, operators watched their circular scopes sweep the darkness, mapping the exact positions of surrounding vessels with electronic precision. By ignoring his best technological asset and putting his flagship at the very front of a blind column, Admiral Callahan guaranteed the upcoming engagement would be a chaotic, high-speed collision. At 0124 on November 13th, the glowing scope painted a terrifying picture. Multiple hostile blips entered Iron Bottom Sound, a body of water already so littered with sunken steel it had earned a grim nickname. 24 minutes later, the two massive columns practically collided. The fleets were so close that ships fired at point-blank range, instantly turning the waters into a bar fight with 14-inch guns. As searchlights stabbed through the dark and star shells burst overhead, Helena used her radar to cut through the blinding chaos. Her fire control locked onto a massive Japanese battleship, the Hiei, at a range of just 4,200 yards. Her guns unleashed rapid-fire salvos that walked methodically up and down the enemy battleship's hull, immediately sparking fires and heavy explosions along its length. In the absolute dark, Helena proved that having a clear electronic view of the target was far deadlier than carrying the heaviest artillery. During the melee, the Japanese destroyer Akatsuki made a devastating tactical error. She turned her searchlight directly onto the Helena, illuminating her own position. Every American ship that could bear immediately pivoted toward the light. Helena's 6-inch shells joined a massive convergence of naval gunfire that literally blew the illuminated destroyer apart, leaving almost no survivors. Helena's gunners immediately shifted to 3 more destroyers. They cycled their weapons so rapidly that Japanese survivors later reported thinking the Americans had deployed a new type of automatic cannon. But the blinding chaos carried a heavy cost. At the height of the action, the American flagship San Francisco drifted directly between Helena and her target. A desperate order to check fire went out to save American lives, but the confusion was absolute. By the end of the 40-minute fight, American shells had struck their own flagship, killing both Captain Cassin Young and Admiral Callahan. Without coordinated radar to share information and identify targets, the pitch-black waters became an indiscriminate slaughterhouse for both friend and foe. When dawn finally broke on November 13th, the Japanese force had withdrawn. Behind them, the battered battleship Hiei lingered in the water with jammed rudders, waiting to be finished off by American planes. The brutal point-blank defense had worked. By stopping the bombardment, Henderson Field survived to launch the aircraft that would savage retreating Japanese transports over the coming days. As the smoke cleared, the physical state of the Helena was astonishing. Her engineers had pushed her turbines past their limits, and her gunners had fired over 1,500 rounds, completely wearing out their gun barrels. Yet she emerged with only minor damage and a single casualty. Surviving the most savage naval engagement of the war forged an intense bond among the exhausted crew and their skipper. The Helena had proven that a heavily drilled crew, paired with superior sensory technology, could break the back of a numerically superior force. But 10 days later, the battlefield triumph collided with administrative reality. On November 23rd, Captain Hoover was abruptly stripped of his command. His offense was a reporting failure, specifically failing to adequately document the sudden torpedoing of the cruiser USS Juno. For the men who had just fought through hell under his steady leadership, the sudden dismissal hit like a physical blow. They viewed it as a bureaucratic vendetta by desk-bound officers who hadn't been in the fight. His replacement, Captain Charles P. Cecil, walked aboard a ship filled with a tightly knit, resentful crew that he now had to win over and lead into their final battles. The men of the Helena learned a sober lesson that November. Survival in the Pacific required enduring 2 brutal forces: the savage artillery in Iron Bottom Sound and the unfeeling, grinding machinery of their own military bureaucracy. Throughout the winter of 1942 and into early 1943, The war in the Pacific was an exhausting cycle of night actions. For the men serving in the Solomons, survival meant staring into pitch-black skies and reading the sea for the faintest hint of a torpedo wake or a falling bomb. In the middle of this grueling routine was the USS Helena. As a heavily utilized light cruiser, she spent her nights bombarding enemy coastlines and supporting troop convoys. By February, her engines wheezed under the constant strain, her gun rifling was worn smooth, and her hull bore the dented scars of repeated near misses. The ship was physically wearing out from the inside. Her crew had become highly experienced veterans of night combat, but that mastery was precariously balanced against a vessel that desperately needed extensive time in a dry dock. In February 1943, the Helena finally received a brief reprieve. Steaming south to Sydney, Australia, the crew left the Score Islands behind for an unblemished city. For a few weeks, the men found fresh food, cold beer, and streets filled with civilians speaking English. They spent those precious weeks remembering what peace felt like. But by April, liberty was over. The Helena was ordered back into the Solomons. Her guns had been refurbished and her crew rested, but the dangers of the slot remained waiting for them in the dark. The Navy viewed this time for repairs and crew rest as a necessary investment, restoring the cruiser's human and mechanical capital before feeding her back into the next, bloodier phase of the campaign. As spring turned to summer, American forces prepared to leapfrog northwest up the Solomon chain to secure airstrips closer to Tokyo. To soften the target on New Georgia, the Helena fell back into a familiar rhythm. Night after night, she would slip into contested waters under the cover of darkness and pummel assigned targets like the Munda airfield and escape back to open sea before the sun came up. During a May 13th strike on Vila, it quickly became clear the Japanese were adapting. To survive the naval bombardments, they had moved their fuel dumps and barracks deep inland, forcing the Helena to blind fire into the thick jungle canopy. Yet the bombardments were effective enough to destroy critical infrastructure. In response, the Japanese military launched a massive, desperate reinforcement effort down the island chain, a movement the U.S. Navy was now obligated to intercept. Naval intelligence quickly picked up on the massive enemy mobilization, and the Helena's crew prepared their ship with grim efficiency. Anticipating the June 30th invasion, extra ammunition was loaded until her magazines bulged, and damage control materials were pre-positioned throughout the ship. When the amphibious landings began at Rendova, the Helena provided the necessary fire support. Her 6-inch shells cleared 100-yard swaths of jungle at a time, silencing sporadic shore batteries as the infantry pushed up the beaches. By July 4th, she was actively bombarding Munda airfield. When Japanese aircraft retaliated, the Helena answered with her 40mm anti-aircraft guns, filling the night sky with a lethal fireworks display of tracer rounds and black flak. The cruiser performed flawlessly throughout the invasion's opening days. But the destruction of the shore positions only accelerated the Japanese timetable, ensuring a confrontation with enemy reinforcement convoys was imminent. That same evening, intelligence spotted another Tokyo Express run, a convoy of destroyers racing south. In response, Task Force 68, with the Helena in column, was ordered to intercept in Kula Gulf. But the environmental conditions were working against the Americans. A full moon was rising over the water, turning the Gulf silver and stripping the Navy of the darkness they relied on for visual concealment. They were sailing into a severe threat. The reinforcement group consisted of 10 destroyers armed with Type 93 long lance torpedoes, weapons capable of striking at 49 knots from 20,000 yards away. At 1:36 a.m., the Helena's radar picked up the convoy at 22,000 yards. But for the first time, American technology didn't provide an early warning. The Japanese had refined their own detection methods and spotted Task Force 68 almost simultaneously. The encounter at Kula Gulf tested a dangerous evolution in Pacific combat: heavy, radar-directed American gunships facing off against high-speed, long-range Japanese torpedo tactics. At 1:57 a.m., the order to attack was given. The Helena's turrets erupted, her first radar-directed salvos finding the Japanese flagship at a range of 11,000 yards. The enemy destroyer was obliterated in minutes. But as the flagship burned, the remaining Japanese destroyers executed their counter-tactic. They launched a massive volley of nearly 50 long lance torpedoes into the Gulf, then turned away at high speed, abandoning gunfire for torpedo accuracy. As the Helena shifted her guns to a new target, a fatal logistical reality caught up with her. The ship ran out of the flashless powder she had carefully hoarded for night actions, forcing the crew to load standard propellant. The switch was catastrophic. Every time the Helena fired, the standard powder acted like a spotlight, brilliantly illuminating her superstructure against the night sky and providing a perfect glowing target for the incoming torpedoes. At 2:03 a.m., 3 long lances struck the cruiser. The massive explosions shattered her bow, broke her keel in half, and flooded the engine rooms, instantly plunging the internal compartments into darkness as all electrical power failed. As the broken ship began to jackknife into 3 separate sections, the gunners in the aft turrets refused to abandon their posts. They continued to load and fire the heavy guns manually, pulling the triggers until the listing deck made it impossible to elevate the barrels. The Helena sank within minutes. Despite possessing veteran experience, devastating firepower, and the best radar operators in the fleet, a single logistical limitation, the lack of flashless powder, stripped the ship of her concealment and ultimately her life. It is dawn on July 6th, and Kula Gulf is littered with the debris of battle. Nearly 500 survivors from the USS Helena are still in the water, using the floating bow and stern sections as temporary life rafts. During the night, the crews of the Nicholas and Radford pulled 739 oil-soaked men from the waves, forming human chains to haul them over the side. But with the sun rising, Admiral Ainsworth faced a choice. Daylight would bring Japanese aircraft, exposing his destroyers to certain attack while they sat stationary. Radar confirmed that Japanese warships were still in the area, holding positions that threatened the remaining rescue force. Remaining in the Gulf meant risking the ships and the 700 survivors already on board. In the logic of naval warfare, the destroyers could not stay to finish the job. Ainsworth ordered his ships to withdraw. As the destroyers steamed away, hundreds of the Helena's crew were left behind in the water. With the fleet gone, the rescue operation ended. Survival now depended entirely on the endurance of the men clinging to the wreckage. The tropical sun burned exposed skin while salt water worked into open wounds. Sharks, drawn by the blood of the injured, began to circle the groups of survivors. Lieutenant Commander John L. Chu took charge of the men on the floating stern. He organized watches, rationed the small food supply, and stabilized the wounded. When Japanese float planes arrived to strafe the survivors, the men were forced to dive beneath the twisted steel of the stern for cover. On the night of July 7th, 4 American ships returned to the Gulf, moving silently through the darkness to avoid detection. The rescue teams used whaleboats and rubber rafts to pull 165 men from the water and the floating stern section. The twisted stern section finally slipped beneath the waves and sank just as the very last of the men were pulled to safety. While these men were successfully evacuated, 88 other survivors were drifting toward the coast of Japanese-held Vella Lavella. These 88 men reached the shore of Vella Lavella, finding themselves trapped behind enemy lines. The island's thick coastal jungle offered concealment, but it was heavily patrolled by Japanese forces. Their presence was reported by Coast Watcher Reverend A.W.E. Sylvester, who worked with local native scouts to guide and hide the Americans. This map shows the Japanese patrol zones the survivors had to avoid. Moving only at night, living on coconuts, the group evaded discovery for a week. Guided by native scouts, the men navigated to the northwest coast, staying clear of enemy camps. On July 16th, 4 American destroyers arrived for a daring daylight rescue, pulling the last of the survivors off the beach before the Japanese could intercept them. The success of the evasion relied on the decentralized intelligence of the Coast Watchers and the local knowledge of the native scouts. In total, 700 members of the Helena's 868-man crew survived the sinking and the subsequent ordeal in the water and on the island. The Helena had become a legend in the fleet for her rapid-fire barrages, earning her the nickname the machine gun cruiser from the Japanese. Her loss highlighted the danger of the visual signature from naval guns at night. The blinding flashes helped the enemy range her, leading the Navy to fast-track the use of flashless powder. The ship's performance also validated her pioneering use of radar for night targeting, which was adopted as standard doctrine for surface combat. These combat experiences led directly to revised damage control procedures and tactical changes that were implemented across the Pacific Fleet for the remainder of the war. In April 2018, an expedition led by Paul Allen set out to find the Helena's final resting place. The research vessel RV Petrel located the ship in 2,800 feet of water in the Kula Gulf. Remote cameras found her hull number 50 still visible on the stern, with her turrets still trained out toward where the enemy had been. The discovery provided the families of the crew and the few remaining survivors with the exact coordinates of their ship's grave. The USS Helena remains a testament to the crew that turned the tide at Cape Esperance and Guadalcanal, and the rescuers who risked their own ships to bring them home.